Live? Ken, are we live? Okay. Good evening. Pardon?
I want to just kick it off. Yeah.
Oh, you want to kick it off?
Yeah.
Okay, you have to stand over here.
Okay.
All right.
Hello. A little housekeeping for tonight. The Dance Palace wants us to have masks, so thank you all for cooperating on that. And they also want to make sure that you've signed the contact tracing information at the desk. That is all that's for. We're not using it for any other lists. I fold it up and put it in an envelope in their office when I leave. Many thanks to Mark Switzer for agreeing to moderate tonight. And also thank you to the participants, especially Jordan Reeser from County Fire, who jumped in at the last minute when we needed somebody to pitch hit for some of the information about MWPA. We will start off with some questions that came in ahead through email, and some of them were even formatted to be cut and put right on a card, which was very clever. We have 4 assistants: Trevor Bridgewater, Susan Allen, Eileen Connery, and I think Peggy Day from Point Reyes Village Association, but the first 3 are Rotarians who came to help. And I think that's it, and I'll turn it over to you. You might want to have the sound on your thing totally off.
Do I want it off?
Yeah, because it's very distracting.
Okay. Okay, some other housekeeping about the format. Ken, I think I might get some feedback, so I should turn my speaker off, huh?
Definitely not be listening on your speaker.
Okay.
That's what I was.
Okay.
Just turn your speaker all
Got
the
it.
way up.
Okay. So, a couple things. If you have your cell phone on, either turn it off or put it on airplane mode, because we need to have all of the Wi-Fi bandwidth that we can manage here. Right, Ken? Okay.
And also can interfere with the wireless ones.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. And then the other thing is that we're going to, of course, we're dealing with people that are tuning in via Zoom. And those of you that are tuning in via Zoom, this is a webinar broadcast, so you will see the panelists and myself here, and you won't see each other on Zoom, as you might be familiar with. But you can, and you should, put your questions in the chat on your Zoom screen, okay? And we have a monitor in the back that is looking at those. Ann Elliott, who will be writing down your questions and then bringing them up to me. And I would ask you, when you're forming a question, to consider who you're going to direct it to, if there's a single individual, or to the panel. That would be helpful, because I won't necessarily want to guess who it's directed to. And if there's a question to a specific panelist, there'll be an opportunity for the other panelists to have a response to that answer. Okay? Okay. So the format we're going to use, we have about an hour and a half. And we're going to ask the panelists to make some brief opening remarks, very brief, to identify sort of who they are, what their perspective is, and an indication of what their particular interests or expertise is around this issue. And then we will go into questions. And the goal of this forum tonight is to answer as many questions as possible. So after the initial introductory remarks, we will go to questions, and we hope to get through all of the questions, or at least some version of a question that you might have, because there'll undoubtedly be some redundancy, and we'll do our best to minimize that. I think that another logistical problem will be the fact that we're in 2 audiences, and so we'll have to kind of juggle how to manage questions from the audience as opposed to questions from Zoom. Okay. So, are there any logistical questions? Very good. Okay, and I hope everyone has signed in at the front, which is the Dance Palace asked us to do that, as Kathy mentioned. Okay, so I'm going to just ask the panelists to introduce themselves in sort of an order and take about 4 minutes, if you will, to again identify not just who you are, what your name is, but also sort of what perspective you're bringing to this conversation or this forum. And so I'll start with Ken from IPUD.
Thank you, Mark. My name is Ken Emanuels. I'm the board president at Ipod, and I want to be sure that you all know that Kathy Donohue is here. She's another member of the board, and I don't think anybody else, it's hard to see, is here. Other board members include Brent Johnson, Bill Press, and David Press. I knew his father, and Dakota Whitney. Our position is not to support. Our position is neither support nor oppose, and that's very important. We see positives and negatives, and frankly, we're conflicted. So that doesn't help you much, I know. But I'll go through, if there are questions, the positive things we see about this measure and the concerns we have. I do want to point out that I want to remind everybody what IPUD is and what it's not. IPUD is a very small, basically a water agency in Inverness, has attached to it a volunteer fire department. We have 5 full-time employees. That is full-time equivalent. We have more employees than that, but they're mostly part-time, so 5 full-time equivalents. So it is very small, very competent. Spend most of our time delivering high-quality domestic water. There is an active volunteer fire department, and our fire chief, Jim Fox, is part-time as well. He is primarily what I would call our water superintendent or director of operations, basically runs the water side. Our training in terms of the volunteer fire department is structural fire, just like most traditional fire departments. So we are not trained and not expert at this point in wildfire protection. We supplement and are an addition to the primary fire department we in Inverness enjoy, and that's Marin County Fire. They're the 24/7 professional firefighters. And when we have a house fire in Inverness, volunteers usually arrive sooner because we're closer and scope it out, and sometimes, if it's very small, can put it out. But they supplement the professionals that arrive a few minutes later from Point Reyes Station. So it's important to realize that that's our professional, full-time, 24/7 fire department, not Inverness. They also have paramedics, which are outstanding, and they do, and Jordan will speak to this, they do some wildfire mitigation. So I could go on, but I think maybe in response to questions, I might add later on why we took a neutral position, the positives we see, and the concerns we have. But I'll respond to those in questions.
Thank you, Ken. That was 2.5 minutes. That's great. Thank you very much. Okay, Jerry.
Okay, I'm Jerry Meral. I'm on the board of Fire Safe Marin, but Fire Safe Marin does not have a position on this, so I'm not speaking on their behalf. And I'm on the board of the Inverness Association, obviously. I want to say, first of all, that everybody on this panel, and I think everybody in the room, are friends. We will be friends before this measure was on the ballot, and I think after it's over, regardless of the outcome. This is not the oyster war. We're all trying to do the same thing. We don't want Inverness to burn down. We don't want to lose our houses. We don't want to lose our lives. And I think we all agree on that. And the only question is, what's the best course to achieve that? I pay a lot of attention to Mark Brown, who's the head of the Marin Wildfire Prevention Authority, and he says 2 things. One is every acre of Marin County will burn at some point. I've heard him say that over and over again. The other thing he always says is 99% of all fires are relatively small, at least at the beginning, and need to be dealt with defensible space, home hardening, a sufficient water supply, and firefighting capability, and that's certainly true as well. Not everyone in Inverness can afford defensible space and home hardening. It can be very expensive, and while many people are wealthy and can afford it, a lot can't. The program that Marin Wildfire Prevention Authority has in that regard is very small. We can talk about that later, but it's certainly not going to solve the problem in Inverness. We are in the highest fire risk category as far as CAL FIRE is concerned, and we need to be ready. The planet is warming, our climate is warming, we're getting more dry lightning. We have a huge drought, and it doesn't show any sign of stopping, despite yesterday. And doing nothing is really not the answer anymore. We've done nothing for a long time. Can we be saved by the Marin Wildfire Prevention Authority? Inverness is 0.2% of the Marin population. Not to say we're entirely on our own, we get some support, but they are not going to solve our problem. I hear over and over again, can IPUD walk and chew gum at the same time? Well, yes, I do believe you can. And I think the statement in the IPUD board about what they would do if this measure passes is excellent. I see a copy of that's being passed around, and I would refer you to that. Is there a plan? Yes, if you go to invernessfireprevention.org, you will see a draft plan. But more importantly, IPUD asked for language that requires the first money of this measure to be used to develop a multi-agency plan with a lot of long-term thinking. And I would encourage you to read the measure, and if I get a chance, I'll read that paragraph later on. Does anyone here know of someone whose insurance has been canceled? Yeah, okay, I certainly do. The state insurance commissioner has said, quote from their website, if you want to keep your insurance and you want to make it affordable, I'm reading now, a community should have clear funding sources to implement community mitigation activities and meet clear risk reduction goals. If this measure is going to cost you $300 a year or so, whatever it is, that's, even if it did nothing else, if it prevents your rates from going up hugely or losing your insurance entirely, it's a worthwhile investment.
1 minute, Sherry.
Okay, just one last comment, and I'll talk more about what the measure does later. But it took 30 years and 4 public votes before the voters of Inverness decided to buy the water system. And Ken didn't have to live through that whole period, but it was painful. And one of those votes lost by 1 vote. We don't have 30 years to settle this issue. We need fire protection. We can get it through Measure O, and I hope everyone will vote for it.
Thanks, Jerry. Also, one other housekeeping thing. Let's not do any applause in the spirit of everyone being friendly here. So just, no cheering, okay? So, Tomas.
Gracias. Hi, everybody, participants and the moderator, Marco. Thanks for coming out to the Dance Palace, and thanks for all the people. Are the people online?
Yeah, they
Anyway,
are.
hi.
I hope they are.
Thanks,
Anyway.
thanks for hooking up with us. I look forward to answering your questions in a moment. My name's Tom Gaiman. I've lived in Inverness for 36 years, and I'm a registered professional forester licensed by the state. And during my career, I've worked with the public and private landowners, nonprofits, state parks, CAL FIRE, the U.S. Forest Service, and on many community forestry and fire mitigation, protection, and assessment type projects throughout the state. Tonight, we're here to consider the implications of Measure O. And this is a new and open-end tax proposal by one individual, and it capitalizes on voters' fundamental fear of wildland fire. And if you read Francine's article in the paper this week, it's a double tax proposal that basically duplicates a lot of what the monies you already pay to Marin County Wildfire Protection Agency, which what I refer to as MWPA, after Woody. Woody's here somewhere. He even invented that. Anyway, there's no specific plans at all for this open-ended parcel tax. We don't know what we're voting for. It's just a new pot of money. Many of the initiatives generally proposed for Inverness, I think, are impractical and haven't been objectively analyzed or even reviewed by fire or natural resource professionals. Of course, we want healthy, sustainable, native wildland, urban forests, shaded fuel breaks, emergency escape routes, and reduced forest fuels. I don't think there's any debate about where we need to be. But though it takes time, our forest management and fire hazard reduction efforts must be in concert with the detailed planning that then would be approved by CEQA and the permitting agencies and the state and federal park partners that we need to work with because they control most of our local forest lands. MWPA, it's a complex agency and it's already working on chipper days, access, fuels reduction, emergency planning, inventories, permitting, and multiple fuels reduction challenges. And it has the resources, it has $20 million a year to implement these broad strategies. And less than 1% of that tax base, IPUD will never have the resources to replicate and duplicate what MWPA is doing. And beware also that the proposed tax would fundamentally change our valued IPUD, which supplies us with great local water and emergency services. Even some IPUD employees have voiced opposition to Measure O.
1 minute, Tom.
And half or more of the new parcel tax would pay for a difficult-to-find wildland fire program manager who probably would also have to retain that person, or a $250 hour consultant, not like me. And the remainder would be insufficient to do much of anything on the ground. So residential defensible space is important and already mandated by law. So while protecting each house, and this is a slide I wanted to show, defensible space work in high-density areas like Inverness aggregately creates fuel breaks, and many of these are already in place. For further work, there's abundant grant funds available. I was looking at the CAL FIRE website. They have over $100 million to distribute each year. And so the Board of Trustees and the IA Board are torn. They have declined to support Measure O. It's a forever tax. In my view, the professional agency that's been developed with your tax money, Marin, is working hard to plan, get permits, and allocate funds, and put the work on the ground where it's most needed. So I'm hoping you will, and you'll urge your neighbors to vote no on O, with all due respect to everybody here at the table.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Look forward to your questions.
I can see one question, easy to answer in the chat. Somebody on Zoom is asking how many people are in the room, and I count about 33. Okay.
How many people are on Zoom?
No, somebody on Zoom is asking how many people are
We want to
here.
know how many are on Zoom.
Oh, I don't know how many are on Zoom. Do we know, Ken? 30? Okay. Okay. Jordan Reeser Captain Jordan Reeser is with Marin County Fire Department, and I'll let him introduce himself and a little bit about the MWPP.
MWPA, yes. Well,
MWPA.
good evening, everyone. Jordan Reeser with the Marin County Fire Department. I don't have a prepared statement. I'm not going to make a statement in regards to Measure O. I'm definitely here to hopefully provide some answers, because I know there are the program of work potentially associated with the measure and other things crosses over a lot of different boundaries, right? Jurisdictional, political, as well as financial and fiscal responsibility agencies. So hopefully, if there are questions specific to Marin County Fire Department's role in managing fuels and vegetation management in West Marin as it relates to the MWPA, as it relates to the state parks, as it relates to the national parks, hopefully I can help provide some of that. I've been working in the fire arena for over 30 years. A majority of that time was spent with the National Park Service throughout the country. I was the fire management officer, fire chief here in the Bay Area for a number of years before I transitioned over to the Marin County Fire Department about 5 years ago. So I'm intimately familiar with the fuels, vegetation, politics of the local systems, and also with the national parks as well as the state parks. I am a local. I was born and raised in San Geronimo, so I am a West Marin native, and still very proud of that. I'm just really here to help answer maybe some questions. We're actively engaged in vegetation management throughout the county, the state. We're a CAL FIRE. We represent CAL FIRE in the state, so we are a state responsibility agency. I'm responsible for fire protection and prevention on state responsibility lands as well as local responsibility areas that are part of Marin County. And those state lands include all the state park lands out here, and we also have an agreement with the National Park Service currently for fire protection on Point Reyes National Seashore, as well as the Golden Gate National Recreation Area. We have a crew program that's developing that I'm in charge of at the moment, where by next year we'll have 4 14-person fire crews working for the county, with their primary mission being fire suppression and response. However, when they're not responding to fires and they're not actively engaged in operations, they're going to be actively involved in fire prevention actions, and they are currently. There are numerous, as Jerry would say, there's numerous, or as Tom's mentioning, state grant opportunities out there. We currently have 3 or 4, I can't remember because they're kind of bleeding over, probably in excess of $4 million right now currently active with Marin County, mostly in the San Geronimo area, in some of the hills above Fairfax, in San Rafael and other places. So this is an opportune time to take advantage of the state funds that are out there. But with those funds obviously come people that need to manage the projects, people that need to develop the plans, people that need to engage with the environmental communities. And then on the MWPA front, quickly, I kind of am the pseudo lead for the West Marin Fire Chiefs because they all are volunteer. Jesse Perry, George Krakauer, and Jim. So I've kind of been gathering them all together to try to come up with a common work plan that we can all agree to, and we've been very successful. We've had some limitations based on some of the recent Coastal Commission stuff. We've been trying to wade through that. So I'm pretty intimately involved in the MWPA, not only the distribution of the funds. I probably understand more than I would like to about everything going on at the MWPA because it is a complex, and there's 17 taxing agencies. They're not all fire agencies, and that complicates things pretty quickly as well. So I'm here to help. Hopefully, if there are specific questions, some of my historical experiences and current experience as far as implementing fuels management projects and vegetation management and defensible space and everything. So I'm just happy to be here. And if I don't have any questions to me, that would be great, but I'm happy to answer as many as come my way.
Not going to let you off that easy. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so let's see, any issues from the audience? Or Ken, are we doing okay up there?
I think we're pretty good.
Okay, and the broadband's okay, transmission's okay, good. Okay, so I'm just going to go right to the questions. Again, the goal of this is to answer as many questions as possible. And the first one I have in front of me is to the IPUD, specifically. Removal of fuels which impair the utility of roads and trails needed for access by firefighters or for evacuation. Now, this is 2D. I think this is in reference to the initiative? No. In any case, is this a necessary augmentation of funds currently administered for such purposes by IPUD from its current parcel tax and allocations from Marin County Transient Occupancy Tax and MWPA? So I guess what this is referring to, this 2D, is one of the goals of the MWPA, 2D? Well, in any case, I guess the question is, is this added revenue measure a necessary augmentation of current funds administered for such purposes by IPUD from its current parcel tax and allocations from Marin County Transit Occupancy Tax and MWPA? I don't know is also an answer.
That's a really complicated question.
Yeah. Just what,
Is the question whether we need Measure O funds? Is that the idea?
well, maybe you can answer that.
The reference had to do with Measure O, the numbers, the codes for Measure O. So
Okay.
it was asking if that's what it was referencing.
Okay.
A portion of Measure O, and then asking if these were,
Got it.
how valuable are these for supplemental resources?
Okay. You want to pass for now?
Well, I don't understand the question.
Okay. Well,
We have Measure O funds, which are potentially available, $265,000, $70,000 a year. And is the question can they be used for? Is that it?
is it a necessary augmentation of funds currently administered for the purposes
Well,
by
yeah,
IPUD?
that's the heart of the issue. Do we need Measure O funds in addition to what we currently have? And I think one of the reasons for the IPUD board hesitating and not endorsing this measure is that we're not sure.
Well,
We're
I'm
not-
sorry, Ken, I realize that that's the question in reference to the idea that IPUD needs funding for removal of fuels which impair the utility of roads and trails needed for access by firefighters or for evacuation, to the extent that the IPUD is already doing that.
We always need funding for that source, and I think we're getting it right now in terms of clearing the, for example, the Perth Fire Road and Vision Road is eligible for evacuation route clearing. So
Okay.
that's taking place right now under from the Marin Wildfire Protection Agency Authority.
Okay. Next question, let's see. So this is for either Tom or Jerry. How can the recent experience of planning, funding, and constructing the shaded fuel break in Sea Haven be applied to the much larger IPUD and state park lands adjacent to Inverness? Sorry?
Want me to answer that?
Sure, go ahead.
There's a lot of different ways. The project that we did in Sea Haven, which for those of you who don't know about it, we did a shaded fuel break on the boundary of Tomales Bay State Park, reaching 100 feet into Tomales Bay State Park, which is the limit that parks will let us work on their boundaries. And I delineated the area on the ground. We got the landowners to consent. We did all of the environmental work, although we did not get coastal permits because we interpreted, and I think the county people interpreted coastal permit as not being necessary. And we did the work on the 6 acres and put in an effective shaded fuel break. It cost $40,000 that was raised, or $42,000 I think it was, that was raised completely by the neighbors. And I have a slide I was going to show, which I guess we can't show you this evening, but I could email it out or whatever. But basically, there's a variety of areas around Inverness that could use fuel breaks. And the question is not whether or not these projects need to be done, it's the process of how we get there.
Okay.
And that's the part that an often used phrase in reference to this is the cart has been put before the horse, because there is no plan. So we really don't know the answer to the question,
Okay.
but we do know how to do it when the day comes.
So Jerry, do you have any comment
I
on
would
that?
just add, I totally agree that I love the project. You should all come up and see it. It's just remarkable. It's going to need to be maintained every few years, but that's true of all these projects. And I also agree with Tom that we need to do more of them. The Measure O language clearly authorizes the use of the funds for that purpose. So if IPUD board decides that's one of the things they want to spend the money on, they can do that.
Any other comments? Okay. Okay, maybe one directly to, this is for either Jordan. Oh yeah, for Jordan. Can you explain why we hear that IPUD only gets $21,000 when it seems County Fire also gets this quote core, unquote, core money that should be available to benefit Inverness? Are mitigation projects different from the core goals?
Well, so basically, I think that there was something was sent out. I'm not sure who got to see it. So there's basically 3 pots of money. This big tax revenue comes in. There's direct funds that go to all of the 17 taxing jurisdictions, IPUD being one of them. What did $21,000 was that the number? So IPUD gets 2 pots of that money. One is for to perform defensible space inspections, an expectation and requirement of the money, and then the other pot of money is to use locally for projects that meet the goals and objectives of the MWPA. So that's at local control. So all 17 agencies get a different amount of money solely based not on the threat, not on the size of the community, but on the taxable parcels, right? And so that's why when you look at the numbers, San Rafael, Novato have very large budgets. Even Marin County, our responsibility area, which is by far the largest, has a very small budget even in consideration of that, just because of not number of taxable parcels. So then the question then goes to the west, then it's broken into 5 zones. We have the west zone, which is eligible, has the 60% percentage number of the total. So there's this pot of money, it's $300 and something thousand this year, which is allocated basically for area-wide benefit projects that are from the White Hill, summit of White Hill, all the way to Tamales, right? Everything in West Marin down to Stinson Beach. Muir Beach is actually in southern zone. So there's this pot of money that can be utilized within that entire area to do vegetation management work and other things. And one of the projects that we've been proposing was this base level, starting to support some evacuation routes, which is where the Coastal Commission got involved with MWPA or through MWPA. So we have been setting money aside to do evacuation route roadside clearance in the communities, but we really haven't been able to go forth with that yet because they haven't, the process through the Coastal Commission, even though we did just finally receive a permit from the Coastal Commission, or I shouldn't say it like that, because the county is, and that gets, I'm not a Coastal Commission expert, so a permit was approved. They're expecting, they have till the 21st for people to respond to that, to challenge it. So we're waiting for the 21st, which is soon, before they start deciding on how we can start to implement some of that work.
I see the complexity that you're dealing with.
And I think it's interesting, when you look at the Coastal Commission as well, I'm learning more than I would like to about the Coastal Commission. They're a huge bureaucracy with a lot of political power and also a little bit of a boondoggle, I would call it at times. And there's also areas in Inverness that have, Marin County has the ability to issue the permit for the Coastal Commission, but then there's other areas where the state has the responsibility. So the permit that was applied for doesn't include any of those streets or those areas that are actually covered under the state's jurisdictional responsibility, because MWPA felt like that would just, then none of it would pass. So
Sure.
because the coast, so it is very convoluted, but there are funds available. We work with the fire chiefs, and we're hoping that as the Coastal Commission issues start to resolve, or we have a clear direction, we'll be able to, we would be able to implement and target funds additionally to the community-based shaded fuel breaks as well. That comes from this larger pot.
Thank you, Jordan. Complicated. Jerry, so this is a question about in the Measure O, no more than 5% of the net revenues generated by this ordinance and distributed to the district may be spent for administrative costs. The question is, what constitutes administrative costs compared to implementations costs? Is it realistic to restrict administrative costs to 5%?
Right. The language, the 5% language is pretty standard. Almost all state bonds include that kind of language. And I should say, in this case and in many, many other cases in this measure, we consulted very, very closely with IPUD. IPUD asked for 40, I don't know, a lot of changes to the original draft of the measure. We included them because they have to carry it out, so obviously we want to respond. They felt that the 5% was reasonable. The 5% is to do the bookkeeping, essentially, to make sure the funds are being spent in consonance with what the measure requires, to do audits, to pay checks, things like that. But the 95% is available to carry out the purposes of the measure. And if you look at state bonds, this is very standard language in state bonds. They always allow 5% for administration, and that's administration with a small a, basically allowing the proper carrying out of the measure, but not the implementation. The 95% goes to fuel reduction, to water, all the other purposes of the measure. Does that explain?
Well, I would just explain, it would also go to a contract employee we might have who would administer the programs for us, or a new employee who would administer the programs for us. So it would, as Jerry said, it would goes to those who administer the program, might be salaries, as well as program costs.
Yeah, this is sort of elaborating on that. Is the question is for will IPUD coordinate all the many potential uses of funds with the many other agencies and utilities whose business is to oversee or carry out or fund similar projects? Will there be a master database and map to track all projects undertaken by all parties? Will there be a budget for staff and long-term record keeping?
Yes. Yeah, I don't think IPUD has very capable staff, and if this were to pass, I am very confident that our staff would get right on top of it. Our board would be very positive about creating programs. What I see us doing is initially calling in people like Jordan and trying to determine what sort of programs, given our geography and our topography, what is the most cost-effective wildfire prevention program that we can have, series of programs that we can have. What makes most sense for us? How much do they cost? How long does it take to carry them out, and do they need to be repeated over time? And then I would see that we would develop a budget, probably a 5-year budget, maybe a 10-year budget. That would include an additional employee, might be contract employee, maybe it'd probably be part-time, maybe a part-time regular employee. It's hard to know at this time. And then we would see whether these program costs, whether we have funding for it, whether there's grant money for it, whether CAL FIRE or the county or Marin Wildfire Protection Authority can fund these programs. If they can't, and we think we have high priority needs that we've analyzed and that we've specified and that have been recommended to us, then I think it might make sense for us to come back and ask for a tax increase. But that's the way I think our board would look at it.
Mark, could I just read one sentence?
Sure, please.
This is language that IPUD requested be included, and it was, the first priority for expenditure is, this is a quote, creation, maintenance, and updating of multi-agency-based plans and programs to identify the Inverness community's specific vulnerabilities to wildfire threats and develop and implement fire-adaptive, cohesive strategies for reducing the risk of wildfire and enhancing the capability to effectively respond to and manage wildfires. And I give IPUD staff really with a lot of credit for that, because we need to have a plan, and you can't have a good plan without spending some money on it.
Great. Okay, so Tom, as a forestry question, can shaded fuel breaks on the west slope of Inverness Ridge significantly reduce the risk of loss from catastrophic fire advancing from adjacent wetlands? Where would they effectively be located in the watershed's steep terrain?
Well, the answer to the question is maybe.
Maybe?
The best place to locate a fuel break, of course, is along a ridge. So the Inverness Ridge would make a very good fuel break, except there's not a whole lot of fuel on the other side, and that's not what we're trying really to protect. So the fuel breaks really that are the most valuable in Inverness are those fuel breaks that are defensible space around people's houses. And linked all together, they make a shaded fuel break. Not necessarily the best location, but except for the fact that they're the ones with most proximity to the houses themselves. So there'd have to be some give and take, because just cutting a swath in the side of Mount Vision is going to have limited efficacy as part of this process. On the other hand, up at where a wind-driven fire coming from the north, from Hartzell or Shell Beach, into Sea Haven, a shaded fuel break, which is largely constructed at this point, could be a very effective place to stop a fire and for fire personnel to feel safe and take a stand against a fire that was coming into an area of houses that also had defensible space. So there's good chance that all fuel reductions are valuable.
And just for my own curiosity, the project up in Sea Haven, was that a shaded fuel? Would that be called a shaded fuel break? Right.
Yes.
Yeah.
Can I just add a little to that? I think it's important just with to not get caught up in nomenclature and wording, but it's really critical that people understand, I think what these terms mean, and they mean different things to different people, and what the vision is for a fuel break, right? And I think it's, and he alluded to it, that the real intent where we've been applying these for decades and centuries now is not this idea that we can put in some type of vegetation modification that's going to stop a fire is not practical. It'll stop a low-intensity fire, moderate-intensity fire. Those typically aren't the ones we're super concerned with as far as impacting our communities, right? We can still have isolated torching and other things that could throw embers onto houses, and that is a concern. But the real goal of most of the shaded fuel breaks, vegetation management zones, really is to provide safe firefighting opportunities to take actions to protect communities, even if they're on ridge tops. It's not there. The expectation is not that the fire will burn to the ridge top and go out. It's that we can have firefighters and fire personnel and operations occurring on that ridge top to hopefully hold the ridge top. So it's not this vision of, oh, we'll go out and treat the forests and then the fire is just going to stop at these places. I think the real intent is to provide safe working environments for firefighters where they're strategic, in ridge tops and community boundaries. At this point, based on the state of the vegetation, are the realistic approaches in these communities.
Great, okay. And Ken, there's a lot of questions for the IPUD, so just so you know, maybe you can't answer them all, but, okay, that's around fuel breaks. Is IPUD capable of implementing the programs and projects listed in the initiative, given the initiative's projected initial annual income, approximately $276,000, with COLA not to exceed 3%, IPUD's administrative history and current budget as primarily a municipal water service and secondarily a volunteer fire department?
The answer is yes. We have a very competent staff. We would be adding to the staff. We couldn't do all of these things all at once. It would be stretched out over a number of years, I'm sure. We have to set priorities. But no, I think it's possible. We would have to add staff, though, that's for sure.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay. So, Jerry, if IPUD had independent funds, could IPUD joint venture with I don't understand why I have trouble with this, MWPA for projects, and could MWPA do all the administrative work with their large staff?
Well, Jordan may be better capable of answering this
Yeah, maybe
question than
you
I am, but I'm a close observer of MWPA as part of FERN, a bunch of environmental groups who kind of monitor what MWPA does. My impression of their projects, and we had a great field visit to one of them over in the Ross Valley, was that they're all cooperative. That one, I think, was with San Rafael, City of San Rafael, and Open Space District was a partner in that one, Marin Fire. My impression of the project, the major projects that MWPA it does, is they're almost all interagency cooperative projects, and I can't imagine they would turn down an offer by Inverness to participate in one if they felt it was a priority for MWPA.
Mm-hmm. Jordan, comment about potential administrative costs?
Well, we kind of.
Well, I think that from that standpoint, I think there would be some collaboration that if the measure like this, if there were funds available to supplement or to provide matching funds. And I think if the measure passed and this planning effort was the first step of that, one of the benefits I would potentially see is having something in place where then you would have the opportunity to go after other sources of funding, larger MWPA pots, state funds from CAL FIRE has numerous forest health, fire prevention, as well as the Coastal Commission, But I think part of that is having a plan in place, right, to then go after that, because you have to present that. And the matching funds, as Tom would really do, is a lot of times a requirement for many of these grants. It doesn't have to be a 50-50 match, but there needs to be some showing of local involvement or local participation, even if it's with staff, to really, and I am the person who reviews many of these grants for the state, and so we see a lot of different varieties, but having that matching piece, even if it is with staffing, but also with additional funds, really helps elevate the palatability of grants when they're put into the systems.
Yeah, I've got a couple other similar, more detailed questions about how these monies could interface with the authority. What occurs to me, a question is, are there other instances where a local jurisdiction is raising funding for these purposes within their jurisdiction? And if so, for example, here's a question about can the funds be incorporated into MWPA's budget for use in our town?
I think I can't answer for MWPA. Yeah. I don't think that would probably be a realistic, because they would take percentage. I think keeping the funds as local as possible with as much control would be the best use of those dollars locally. But there are, an example, the shaded fuel break, and I think you went and looked at the one in Ross Valley. That was a state grant. I think they got $3.5 million for this year. And that is, and then MWPA is contributing through the core Ross Valley zone another $1 million to that whole project. The same thing is happening in Southern Marin zone, right? And the same thing is now we're engaging with state parks and others out in San Rafael, Point San Pedro area. This kind of collaborative effort of bringing funds to the table from multiple sources that really shows that collaboration and that kind of across agency boundaries mission for this.
Well,
Actually, Mark,
yeah.
in that regard, everyone here probably just voted for a similar thing. The Measure A that was just approved, the renewal of the Open Space and Park District, included specific funds for the Open Space District that they could use to match with MWPA to do cooperative projects, which they're doing in the Ross Valley.
And so maybe another way of posing out of my own curiosity is it fair to say because MWPA is a relatively new entity that it's still how best to work, how to develop it, how to interact is all very much a work in progress, is that?
That's very safe to say.
Okay.
I think they're really developing their working system still, and with the ultimate goal of trying to get work done on the ground, and there are challenges as it relates to sequence, so many other things. So, but that I would say that's a fair statement. Yes.
Okay. So back to Ken. It says, Ken mentioned that IPUD sees both advantages and disadvantages to Measure O. Could you tell us what these are? If you can, pros and cons.
I'd be happy to, but I have to indicate that I am one board member, and there are 5, and I will give you my best interpretation of what the other board members believe, and that's not easy. But we're very conflicted, and I'm sorry to say we weren't able to adopt a position. On the positive side, I think the board sees without question that the measure addresses 2 very critical issues for our community, and that is drought resilience and wildfire threats. And it's something that IPUD has to be dealing with in the future, probably much, much more than we have in the past. And this measure does address that. So that's a very positive aspect of this measure. We have generally 2 concerns. One is, as I said before, we have a very small staff, and there is a concern that this new responsibility, which is outside of anything that we're trained to do in terms of our staff, to be totally new, would be a distraction and to our core function of providing high-quality domestic water. That's something that I think we can prevent, deterioration of our current service, but it was something we have to pay close attention to because this is a real new turn and a real new activity and something that's so different that it will take a major effort apart on our staff, at least at first. So that notion of a distraction is a concern. And the second is just the notion that we've put funding before planning, the horse before the cart. And it's just not as tidy as we would like to have when we're dealing with public tax money. I think our board feels very sensitive about asking our voters and our customers for additional taxes. And what we would really like to do is be able to go to our voters and say, we're asking for your money, mandatory tax money, and we want to use it for X, Y, and Z. And we've costed these programs, and we know that they're effective, and they're recommended by these experts, and they will be very effective. And this is what your taxes are going to pay for, and therefore we'd like your support. In this circumstance, we can't do that because we're looking at a funding source before we have made these plans. So that's a bit awkward, and it's not the way we like to go about our work. And that gives us pause. But I do want to say that if you trust us, I guess is the only way to put it, and put your faith into our ability to plan these programs effectively, that I have total confidence that if the measure passes, the IPUD staff will do an outstanding job and we'll work hard at it, and you'll be very satisfied. But those are the concerns we've had, and the reason we have not taken a position.
Just Ken, a little bit of a follow-on more specifically on that is that I think you've answered it. If Measure O passes, how you would implement the use of the fans, mitigate the risk of fire. But if Measure O does not pass, does IPUD have a plan to create a fire mitigation in Inverness, and how would that be funded?
Well, I'm just one board member, and Kathy's here and she can speak to it. But my sense is the issue of drought resilience, which is very important for us, making sure that there is adequate water supply and our storage facilities are up to date and fire resistant and earthquake resistant, and the threat of wildfire, that's before us now. And it's not going to go away, and I think it's got our attention. It's got the attention of our staff. So I think we will be spending a lot of time at our future board meetings on these issues. And I would expect, for example, next week, Mark Brown is going to attend our board meeting and give us a rundown of how that agency is working and how they might assist our region. And I think we'll pursue other people like Jordan and get advice. And I don't want to be very specific because I'm just one board member, but my recommendation would be to develop what I would call a master plan of priorities, cost them out, and see what we can do with grants, Cal grants or Cal Fire grants and others, and proceed. The issue has been raised.
Right. So it's on your agenda, so you could say.
It's on my agenda and on Kathy's agenda. That's 2 out of 5.
Yeah, Kathy, please, yeah, Kathy. Well, no, Kathy, if you'd like to. Kathy is the board member who is also the representative to MWPA.
Well, I think we're talking about the cart before the horse and everything, and I've been very clear with the other board members of IPUD is, and I come from a hospital background, executive with Kaiser Permanente for 30 years, and so every year you do a hazard mitigation survey. And that's what we need to do here with the wildfire prevention. We need to get a consultant in here, look at our whole area. Tom, you can also be a consultant, and really do an in-depth survey of what our hazards are here in Inverness. And then from there, then we develop the plan on how to mitigate all of that. So that is the horse before the cart. Thank you.
Kathy, would it be nice to have some money to do that with?
We,
Did I say a word or two about that?
just a second. No, I'm not going to take that question right now. Okay, the question was, would it be nice to have some money to do that right now?
I think our budget could afford that.
Yes.
Oh, okay. Tom, did you want to have a comment?
I think that's the appropriate way to go about this. I mean, to establish a task force or a committee and assess the entire situation rather than guess at a number and invite everybody to come on a pipe dream. And that's the way business is done, and I think the IPUD should adhere to that. And I hope that the voters feel that way as well.
Jerry, you might want to respond.
I hope the voters feel there's a need for a plan. There's a mandate in the Measure O to create a plan and implement it. This isn't, I think people maybe have a greater expectation of how much it's going to raise. It's been mentioned $275,000. The IPUD budget is over $1 million a year. This is not a gigantic new infusion of money. I wish it was, I wish it was more, but it's about a 25% increase or something like that in their whole budget. And with the things that IPUD can do here, like replacing wooden tanks, which, believe it or not, we still have. We're gradually getting rid of them, but they need to be gotten rid of. This isn't going to solve all the world's problems, and it isn't going to overthrow IPUD. It's just something we need to do because we're in a new era of climate change.
I might
Sure.
just add that
Yep.
the election is in November of 2022. The first dollars we would receive if the measure passes would be in December of 2023. So that's 13 months of planning, basically.
Jordan, you wanted to
I
say
just
something?
think it's important to note that I know you're not, this community's not on an island in this scenario, right? I think that much of the coastal California has felt the recent impacts to wildfires, right? But these issues have been widespread throughout the West since the West was developed, right? And so there are many communities that have gone through this already, are way ahead of this process. But it feels new to hear, but the development of a community wildfire protection plan, which is different than the community CWPP, is commonplace for certain communities of 20 to 300 homes, where someone comes in, they do a full site assessment, they look at the fuels and fire behavior, and they look at the vegetation and the egress routes and all these things, and then you develop a plan. This is standard. There are many consulting firms out there doing these throughout the West. So I think it's a standard practice. It's not something that would have to be figured out, like, oh, who could do this? There's a number of people, if you put that out to bid, I'm sure would raise their hand and come and give you a quote quickly to produce such a thing. And then I think from the plan development, also from the fiscal piece, this could be an opportunity, and you're going to meet with Mark Brown, for that larger west zone that we talked about, this core zone, to take some money out of that to put into a planning document, to say, hey, let's take some money, whatever that would be, $10,000 to $80,000 or anywhere in between, and see what the opportunities would be there for the support from the MWPA to develop a plan, funding-wise, because that is part of their mission as well. It's not just to get work done, it's to collaborate and to provide more opportunities. So I think that could be a very, regardless if the measure passes or not, right? I think if the measure does pass, that opportunity could potentially still be there to maximize the dollars that are associated with the tax. So I think there's some opportunities in both of those places.
Okay.
And CAL FIRE has, they literally, awarded $4 million to MWPA, and there's 2 other grants of that kind of nature in Marin County. In Sonoma County, there's a whole litter of grants. There's a lot of funding for planning and for wildfire protection throughout the state, and we're eligible for those funds. We don't have to reinvent this whole process. I agree certainly with Jordan.
Actually, I do too.
Okay. You talked about leak detection and elimination in districts' facilities. What evidence is available indicating abnormal water leakage in IPUD's water distribution system?
Well, before the Tenny, and tell me if I say anything wrong here, before the Tenny Tank project, IPUD's delivery rate of processed water to water buyers, that is all of us who live in Inverness, was about 81%. Now, the Tenny Tank's done now, or pretty close to done.
Yeah, all done.
And that will reduce that loss of 18%. I don't think we've had enough experience yet with the Tenny Tanks to know exactly how much it would be. The average urban water district, in that regard, how much water they don't sell after it leaves the treatment plant, is about 3 to 5%. And so I'm hoping after the Tenny Tank project is done that the 18% will be dramatically reduced. But I don't think it'll get down to the 3 to 5% level. And the state requires water districts to produce urban water management plans, but IPUD is small enough that it's exempt from that requirement. However, a good water district, and I think all water districts should look at the requirements of the state, and because they're really well crafted, and try to comply with them. So I don't think we know exactly how much more IPUD can do to reduce the loss of water in a sense. And IPUD's board is generous in letting people not have to pay for major leaks, and that has an effect on that number. But I think we still have a ways to go. We certainly had a long ways to go until the Tenny Tanks were finished, and that was a great project. But there's more to be done. Also, homeowners who don't have the flume device, and some have adopted it, fortunately, don't know really whether they have a slow leak or not. And I think that these funds could quickly be used to get more of our homeowners to use flume or some comparable device, because it's a great way to tell how much you have leakage on your side of the meter, which is wholly different from the discussion we just had about how much IPUD might be losing. Or maybe Ken wants to add to that.
Yeah, I think our big problem at IPUD with so-called leakage is people whose outdoor irrigation systems are broken, And they're not here all week long and maybe not for a month long. And without a flume device, they have no idea they're leaking thousands of gallons. Now, we pick it up pretty quickly because we read meters, but not on a day-to-day basis.
For Ipod, are additional water storage facilities tanks needed to augment existing water storage reserved for wildfire suppression, or locations for storage tanks available for filling firefighter equipment by gravity flow should electric power be unavailable during emergencies?
I think we'd always like to have more storage, that's for sure. Are there sites that are practical? That's something we're looking at. They won't be easy. The easy ones have already been taken. But this measure that's one of the specified uses of these funds.
Okay. Okay. Trying to get organized here. More about fuel breaks. Okay, for Tom, about fuel breaks. Oh, no, I think we asked this one already, about the ridge break. Okay, let me look at the chat here. Okay, here's a, oh, you've been sending them up? Well, here's one that the Point Reyes Light reported that Dennis Rodoni, president of MWPA, supports Measure O. Why does he support Measure O?
I don't think he's here to say. I will say I had the opportunity to discuss it with him, and he feels that Inverness is vulnerable to wildfire and should do everything it can to try to prevent it, and he thinks Measure O is one way to do that. But I hesitate to speak for him any beyond that.
Okay. That, again, somebody's citing the Point Reyes Light. Yeah, I think.
Can I make maybe a statement just on the regards to, Dennis Rodoni is Chief Weber, Jason Weber is our fire chief and is his direct line supervisor, right? The chiefs report directly to the Board of Supervisors. And Jason could not be here tonight. He trusted me, which is always a risky move. But I think knowing Jason, knowing Dennis, and knowing the momentum and the movement that is occurring in Marin, and the MWPA is a good example of that, as well as the Measure A passage. Chief Weber is fully committed, as we are, moving forward with supporting, augmenting where we can, because there is it is in our best interest from the fire department and our fire protection responsibilities, because it's just not about the Ipod, right? We do have responsibilities throughout the Inverness Peninsula, home. We've been doing a lot of work with the Inverness Association in the last couple of years, doing evacuation route clearance, working with the Park Service. So it's in our vested interest as well, not only to help protect our firefighters if they need to come into the communities again, but also just on the larger whole. He's very committed, and I think that partnership will only grow, and our opportunities to augment, supplement, and support are going to be there into the future, regardless of the passage or non-passage of the measure.
Okay. For Tom, could you please describe the process used for the planning, development, and execution of the shaded fuel reduction type project? What's involved with just that type of a project?
There's a lot involved in this process, and you don't always start at the beginning. A lot of times you're dealt a deck of cards that you really have to work with, and it may not be an ideal situation. What happened on Sea Haven on Via de la Vista sort of was an ideal situation, though. We had two large landowners who were surrounded by heavy and dense huckleberry and decaying bishop pine and right up against the state park boundary, which has an overwhelming inventory of dead material. So, and those were at the top of the ridge, at the place where if you did what's called fire modeling, the fire would end up on that ridge, pretty much wherever it came from in Tamales Bay State Park. So we designed a shaded fuel break, which means leaving the big trees and just removing the understory, the woody, fine fuels and medium fuels. I think they're called, they have hour appellations, but they're sort of 1 hour fuels and 3 hour fuels or something like that. The fine fuels and the dried out huckleberry with pine needles draped through them, and all that material was removed by hand. But the process of getting there was to delineate the area and look at it on the topo map and see if it looked like it was going to be an effective place. If there was a place for fire protection staff to take a stand against the fire, so there had to be access from a number of different directions. And then we had to do the environmental work. We looked for rare and endangered plants, and we did a bird nesting survey, and we waited until the spotted owl nesting season was over, because we had a spotted owl nearby. And we consulted with the Park Service staff, and then we...
And how long a process, how much time was involved?
Well, then we raised some money from the community. But we had bids, so we knew how much it was going to cost. The whole process took about 6 months, and the last 6 or 7 weeks of it, we're actually working on the ground. And everybody was cooperative, nobody complained, everybody's delighted. So it was sort of a gratifying project, if you will.
Okay. Jerry, here's a question. Why is there no sunset for Measure O?
This problem is not only not going to go away, it's going to get worse. I mean, I would like to think that we're all happy with the Inflation Reduction Act and we're going to have some new electric cars and so on. But looking at what the rest of the world is doing, we are going to have at least, well, I don't want to say over 2 degrees Celsius increase in temperature, probably more. And so the things are just going to get worse. It's going to get drier. We're going to have more dry lightning storms. And into the future, my suspicion is this won't be enough, because we're going to have a bigger and bigger problem. On the other hand, let's say everything turns out well, or Mount Pinatubo goes off for many years and cools the atmosphere, and the IPUD board decides, you know, we don't actually need this much. All I have to do, excuse me, is go back to the voters and go, are you okay with us reducing this to, 10 cents or whatever? And whatever the IPUD board asks will pass, right? I mean, look at the current measures we've had over the last few years, a 97% vote yes. So it isn't like written into stone. The IPUD board can ask the voters, change this, they will do whatever the board wants. But the need is just going to grow, and it's hard to picture the point at which we will no longer need to do this kind of work.
Did I read in the measure documentation that a simple majority can rescind it? Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So I'm not quite sure what this is meaning, but aren't we trying to apply a state solution or process to our small community process we are accustomed to using? Anyone want to take that on? No.
I think that what it means is, are we trying to create a great, huge bureaucracy in our little teapot?
Okay.
A tempest in the teapot, so to speak.
Okay. Okay. So,
That's more of a comment than a question.
for Ken, if, and I think this is, well, I'll ask this question, but if IPUD wanted to get involved in fire protection activities, why didn't they make a plan first, then bring it to the community to vote?
Well, we are involved in fire protection. What they mean is a wildfire protection.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, because we're not a wildfire protection agency, and our staff isn't trained for it, and that's not their orientation. It's the same reason why Marin Fire and Point Reyes Station doesn't protect us against wildfires. They're a structural fire protection agency. Now, this measure and the potential vote by the community, I think, is maybe changing that approach. But we are a domestic, not domestic, we're a structural fire volunteer department, and this would change that. We would be oriented, in addition to structural fire, to wildfire. Totally different ballgame, different training, and this would set us on that road.
Follow up on that, just that it occurred to me, are there other volunteer fire departments in West Marin that are wildfire, what's the terminology?
Well, I think all the departments, in essence, have a wildfire responsibility. Like, if there's a wildfire in Inverness or in Ipod lands, the Inverness Fire Department is going to respond. They're not going to not respond. And so, yeah, you know, they are the only agent that, yeah, because Muir Beach does, Muir Beach, Nicasio, Bolinas, and Stinson all actually have wildland fire fighting engines as well, right? Which is a different type of fire engine than a structure fire engine. So, and their training, maybe they have a little more focus on that because they need to staff those engines and have the expectations that if you have that engine, it could go then respond to a fire if there's needed in San Rafael or anywhere else in the county. So I think all the expectation is all the departments, the volunteer departments, do have some level of wildland fire response, and Jim and his great group has traditionally gone out on the seashore and extinguished vegetation fires, right? And they have the proper PPE and the training and the equipment for it at that base level. So I think it is a standard.
Okay.
But transitioning to a wildland fire, doing the protection and prevention piece is a whole nother, that's a whole different can of worms than just going out there with PPE and trying to fight the fire.
And so no existing volunteer fire department is doing that work at this point?
They're all in a very similar boat in Marin, right? To kind of reacting to the MWPA, figuring out the best way to utilize the MWPA funds to help support protecting their communities.
Okay. I think I've actually gone through a fair representation of the questions. And we have about 15 minutes left. I would like to have the panelists in turn think about issues, questions that they think were not raised that may need some explanation. I mean, there was some pretty detailed questions.
Well, no one asked about the question of insurance, but frankly, it's on everybody's mind. Sure, on my mind. When I get a letter from farmers, I almost have a heart attack before I open it, because I don't know whether it's going to be a rate increase, a cancellation, or just my usual bill. Let's hope it's the latter. But this is a huge issue in California, and tens of thousands of people have been canceled in these wildfire zones. We're in it. We live where they cancel insurance. And if all this measure does is reduce the chance of cancellation or gigantic rate increases, and I know people who've had, have their rates quadrupled in 1 year, if it helps tamp that down, this is a tiny investment compared to the cost of a cancellation. If you ever looked at what it costs to go to the FAIR plan, God forbid you should ever have to go to the FAIR plan, because your rates will go right through the roof. If it helps reduce that chance, even by a relatively small percent, it's totally worth it. It's totally worth it compared to what you'll be paying if you get canceled.
Well, is there any basis to know whether the insurance companies would?
Well, I read a quote from the state insurance commissioner about what you should do to reduce the risk of cancellation, you know, and he was very specific. He said, have local funding and a plan to reduce the risk of wildfire.
Funding
and so
and a plan.
this is the state insurance commissioner giving us a message. We better pay attention to it.
I'd classify that as another scare tactic, and I mean that's sort of irrelevant to what we're talking about. We have the Marin Wildfire Protection Agency, we have IPUD, and what we need is a group of local people to get together and make a plan and figure out how much it's going to cost and what needs to be done, and then go to IPUD and then go to the voter, rather than putting the cart before the horse, as we've alluded to.
If it's a scare tactic, I must say I have two neighbors who've been canceled within the last 6 months, and we had IPUD, we had MWPA, and they still got canceled. So at least that was not enough to convince the insurance company not to cancel them.
Well, besides the insurance issue, any other sort of major thought that we've left out? Jordan?
I think I did state just kind of the chiefs and our commitment to kind of the coast zone, so to speak, and I think it's important that this is IPUD related to Measure O, but the fire threat is not IPUD as an island in the middle of the Point Reyes Peninsula and the Inverness Peninsula, and that developing a plan, it would be fairly short-sighted to look at developing a plan for IPUD and not include Inverness, right, and not include state parks, and not include the national parks, right? Because as we've, those that were here for the Vision Fire, recently on the Woodward Fire, fire moves quickly and across the landscape without recognition of political or taxing jurisdiction. So I think that piece is really where maybe MWPA could bring the groups together to develop a peninsula-wide, focusing on community protection, because there are more residents than just the IPUD residents that are going to be affected by the exact same fire, and would be fairly short-sighted to just focus in on that community boundary and not think about the impacts to the others. So
When you say peninsula-wide, you mean West Marin?
no, I'm thinking more of I guess this is the Point Reyes Peninsula, right? The Inverness from White House Pools out to Ottinger's Hill, and then up on the ridge. That's kind of how I would categorize that, and I wouldn't go out to the seashore, to larger, the ranches and stuff like that. It would just be in those denser communities.
I talked to Cindy Schaefer from State Parks today by email, and I'm trying to act for an update. We did an inventory of Tamales Bay State Parks, trees and forest health and fuels, and Cindy responded right away. State Parks is actively, and you can confirm this, or is actively pursuing all the steps that it takes to get to a point where it can manage the Bishop Pine Forest, which encompass Tamales Bay State Park, and also, hopefully, the 1,000 acres or so that they own, that Parks owns on Inverness Ridge, and develop a forest health plan and management plan for that area that they'll be implementing probably through these CAL FIRE funds.
I think, we actually had a field trip not that long ago with them, like trying to get a real sense of what's feasible, what's not. I think that the fuel loading out there is overwhelming, and it's disheartening in a lot of cases, but I think it's something that they're taking very seriously and they're engaged on. So I think Todd, you're right. They are actively engaged in that. They're developing. They're going to do a CAL FIRE, the new VTP process, environmental compliance document, to start looking at, especially those zones around the communities, extending them out, because the limitations right now, state parks, national parks, open space district, is they kind of have this latitude to allow you to come 100 foot from a home, right, to do work on their property. That's really simply covered in their compliance document. That's documents that are on file in essence, right? So they can, if it's a fire road or against a home, it's not 100 feet from the property boundary, it's 100 feet from a home. So I think very quickly you extend out beyond that, and that's what they're starting to look at. So they are taking an active approach, but it's a daunting task, to say the least, and is going to require a lot of money, but they are actively engaged.
Carlos and Felix Chamberlain and myself met with Armando, the state parks chief, who comes from Marin, and he was very supportive of developing these partnerships and making it happen. So we do have a bigger picture to deal with, and it's a very important part of what we need to do here.
So it strikes me that the tension is between having both the capacity and the resources to best coordinate a wildland fire response for Inverness and West Marin in general. In other words, I hear in the conversation that there's a need for a plan in advance of funding, but on the other hand, it's the cart and the horse thing. There may be not ready funding to do a plan. Is that a fair statement? I wonder the perspective of what should come first, planning or funding. What's your different perspectives on that?
Mine?
No, any panelist.
I would say that you could chew gum and brush your hair and juggle balls and all the other things you need to do simultaneously in today's world, right? I think that they don't have to be this or that in this scenario, right? They can be both of those things.
And are essentially both are happening countywide.
Yeah, and this is an active conversation that's occurring across the county, and MWPA is part of that, but with the local fire chiefs in West Marin in particular. And I think there's ample opportunity right now to strike while the iron's hot, so to speak, right? The vegetation management programs with the state, at the local level, they're there, right? And it's really, part of it's going to be having this consolidated and a community approach that everyone is kind of buying into it, because it doesn't take long, as we've learned with the Coastal Commission and others, for a few dissenting voices to really just, as we know in the political arena, right, to put a stop to things really quickly, right? If someone raises a concern that goes at the right, if they have the right avenues to take that concern to the right people who listen, things get, put on hold really quick. So I think that having as many people on board in a community-wide approach is going to be critical, because there's going to be a lot of little things that come up along the way. If it's, the monarch butterflies, there's a lot of resource things, and then there's visual things. There's just so many things that if the right people speak up, or the wrong people, depending on what side you're on, it can really put a stop to it. So, so it needs to be this really kind of community-wide, and get as much support as possible from as many people as possible, and bringing them all, Fern and other, to the table at the beginning, and not when chainsaws are on the ground or masticators are in the forest.
Any other final thoughts? We're just about out of time.
The point that I've been trying to get across is MWPA is 2 years ahead of us on this. They've got 17 agencies in line with each other, and they've got a strategic plan, and they have the funds. And I think we should see what they can do. But maybe in the meantime, put that committee together and start working on having a monthly meeting and develop that plan and get the maps together and get the resources together so that we can be part of it, rather than an island that's sort of separate and maybe alienating all the agencies that are trying to cooperate.
Jerry? Yeah.
Can't picture Inverness coming up with fire funding and alienating anybody, but we ought to remember, as much as I was very involved in the campaign to pass Measure C, it's only for 10 years, and so MWPA better hurry, because the voters may or may not approve the funding again. I think they would, frankly, but it's not a permanent source of funding. And I think Jordan made the point. They like cooperating with agencies and will never be offended by anyone offering to participate in the kind of work they do. So I don't know, Mark, are there other things we want to cover? I want to mention one last thing.
Sure, no, go ahead.
Okay,
Well, Les, Ken, you have any comment on? No, okay, go ahead, Jerry.
I wanted to say if we could give a round of applause to Mark for doing such a great job moderating.
No applause. Okay, well, I think we are, it is now 8:27. We have 3 minutes left. There is a hand. Oh, well, real live person. You may. Hi, Ann. Yeah.
And I have a perfect spot for a couple of large water tanks.
Oh,
But I'm stymied by the permit process.
okay. Yeah, the comment was that Ann Reed has a perfect spot for a water tank, but the permitting process is so daunting. Would there be help for that? Is that sort of the question?
But I heard somebody on the panel say that you could address the Coastal Commission permit process.
Through
Somebody had authority.
through the authority.
Somebody had authority to allow permit. I went on their website a couple of years ago, and they hadn't done any work on it since 2018. So I'm kind of discouraged.
I think we'll have to try to help you offline on that. Okay.
Doesn't work with our webinar,
Yeah. The problem with we're not, the folks that are joining by Zoom are not seeing these, and I have to repeat the questions. I mean, if it's a question, I think we can take a question, can we not? And I'll repeat the question.
You have a question over there?
Yeah. Question?
Yeah, this is on my part. If we pass Measure O, does that mean we get more funding for Inverness from MWPA and California state grants?
Okay, the question was, if Measure O passes, would that mean you'll get more funding for Inverness through WPA and WPA matching grants?
I am not the distributor of the funds. However, I think at least from the state perspective, as I mentioned before, that matching is a really, the state likes to see local involvement, right? And they like to see that commitment by the locals.
So
And I think that the MWPA, the first time I've ever said it, actually, I think that just is more, though it might elevate some of those projects where we can bring them, because it brings more power to the table for those funds.
So the answer, I think, would be maybe.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Potentially, yeah.
And Carlos, you have a question?
I don't have a question, I have a comment.
Questions?
Mellow comment and it's
Can't you form it in?
You can't hear it online.
Yeah.
The people at home can't hear you.
Well, they can hear.
Well, oh,
I just wanted to address a simple situation that has to do with our community. The reason why things worked so well in that project that was done up there was because we worked and did all the work, and then when we had all the information, we shared it with the community and the group of neighbors, and they were all understood what their money was going for and what it was gonna do. The situation we have is that we have now a division where a lot of people are feeling the cart before the horse. And so I am just suggesting that you think about the concept of all of us being able to feel comfortable after the decision is made, whether it passes or not. Because if I know what my money is gonna be used for, I can guarantee you, bro, you're gonna get my money. We did too. We did up there.
I will characterize your question as, should the measure pass, will it be possible for the community to have direct input into how it's deployed? I'm only going to take questions because we're actually at time, and I think we need to respect that. Obviously, this is going to be an issue, whether or not Measure O passes, fire's not going to go away, and IPUD is definitely going to be challenged with decisions about how to respond to that. So thank you all for attending.
We have one more question.
Yeah, I think we're done. Thank you very much.
There's always one more question.